So what's next for you? You have this show coming up, and what are the next projects, or what's the next phase of Sandy?
Yeah, well, the big thing is, doing another. It's going to be a 60-page issue, so it's probably going to be the biggest one for Marley Davidson that I've ever done. There is a story I'm doing for the next World War III issue, which is going to be on youth and youth activism. It's going to be edited by Hillary Allison and Paula Hewitt-Amram, myself, Tom Keogh, and a few others who've been involved with that magazine for a long time. Really what I want to do is, with this show, is bring some of the stuff I'm doing to the forefront so that I can try and generate funds to do animation and other things that, have in the past been so prohibitively expensive we couldn't really undertake them. But thankfully, for comic artists, for artists in general, technology is just getting cheaper, faster, better. I mean, the camera you're shooting with, 5 years ago, cameras weren't this good. And they were like twice the price. The FXR7 that I shot my 2007 feature with, I gave it to a friend to sell 2 years later because it was outpaced by cameras half the price and half the size. So that's a great development. I think there's this, horror that a lot of artists are feeling because they just feel like so many people are putting so much stuff out there. It's like, I don't know that that's the worst thing in the world. It's people need tools, and I don't know that the world is as Darwinian as we'd like it to be. Stuff that sucks sometimes elbows out stuff that's great, but frankly, that's up to us as an audience. We've in Europe and in America, we're very lazy as audiences, I think, unfortunately, and we don't seek out and defend good material. We still go to see really bad movies just because they cost a lot to make and they're promoted a particular way, and we complain about the quality of everything, but we've allowed the art houses to be shut down. There used to be 6 or 7 independent theaters in New York, and now it's like Film Forum and Cinema 80 and Anthology Film Archives. It's like 3 or 4. That's disgusting. It's horrible. So it's interesting how like a lot of us are complaining about what's happening with native advertising and how that's intruding on formerly great independent websites. Even the New York Times had this really bizarre article about prisons, and the image was a promotional image for Orange is the New Black. Granted, they didn't pay to change anything in the article, but it's the New York Times. You know what I mean? It's like just. But at the same time, you know what? We're not paying for media. We're buying like $200 sneakers and not paying for information that we really need to subsidize and really need. Journalism costs money. Art costs money. Music costs money. And suddenly we're like a generation of infants who don't want to pay for anything, but we still want it to be good. Of course it's going to start to suffer. So... It's happening with everything. Comics are getting more expensive and thinner, which I think is crazy. We can't. You were asking me earlier about why I'm doing this at Word Up. I want everybody's kids. We're hemorrhaging readers. Comics were a gateway drug to me for other literature. Partially because Stan Lee's writing was so overwrought and bombastic. He'd quote Shakespeare in stories, or you open up with some line from some book, and that led me to those books. Comics gave me an very independent sense of investigating things that I was interested in. in the arts.
Are you doing that? Are you following in his footsteps by echoing great works of literature or writers?
No, I try not to do that. I try to, I don't know how happy, somebody like Cormac McCarthy would be if I like quoted him in one of my works. I try to leave the people I respect alone. I guess if they're dead, it's okay and you can do whatever. But certainly for living authors who I like James Ellroy and people like that, I'm not going to do that to them. Yeah, I mean that's one of the things I'd like to do with this presentation is hook kids in on the magic of how this stuff's made and what's really special about it as an art form, because the other thing about media that's really strange, I remember having this feeling as a kid, you see something, it comes to you as a complete object, and it's kind of demoralizing. I used to look at, there was an artist named, he's still around and still doing incredible things, and I just met him at Baltimore Comic-Con last year, but Michael Golden, who was an artist in the 70s and 80s, I used to look at his work and just get absolutely depressed. I mean, I came up as a child in an era where the level of draftsmanship in comic books exploded. Everything post Neil Adams, whether you're talking about Jim Aparo, or Bill Sienkiewicz, or John Byrne, George Perez, those people, and you'd look at your work and go, oh my God, I'll never be able to do this. And then I remember the first time I saw an actual page penciled by somebody. I think it was Bob Layton, who drew Iron Man in the early 80s, and the page was enormous. And I realized they somebody inks this and then they shrink it down, and that's why it looks so detailed and crazy, which is something I totally do, by the way. I mean, my pages are 3 times the size they need to be. In my Marley comics, I'll just show you one page. I mean, people always wonder, there's all sorts of trickery that you do to create compelling images, and in this zombie issue that I did, one of the things I did with the Marley comics was they're all drawn in ballpoint pen.
I'm gonna get another shot of that later. Yeah.
But that page is the original's 3 times the size. And what I did, one of my fellow artists at World War III Illustrated, Mac McGill, is this obsessive pointillist and just has this marvelous depth to his work. And I remember I asked him, how do you do this? He goes, I just sit down an afternoon and I just do it. And I'm just like, that's no freaking answer, right? So what I did, because I didn't have the patience to do what he did, was one afternoon I just grabbed a couple of 11 by 17 sheets and created patterns, really depth patterns, and just Xeroxed them a bunch of times. And this was in the 90s. I couldn't afford Photoshop, so I literally, X-Acto cut these in, and this fence is a fence I've used over and over again over the years. I just basically drew it once on a really big sheet with an X-Acto blade, cut out all the negative spaces, and every time I need it, I just place it over something. I used it in this story for World War III Illustrated, just like last issue. I've had that one thing since 97, because again, I couldn't afford Photoshop. If I had, I would have used it at the time and just done it with an alpha channel, and just knocked it in there. But seeing that page was so incredible, because that page of Bob Layton's, because he had this way of creating surfaces that I was just like, how does he do it? And when you see it at its actual size and see the actual pencil scratch, and you're just like, oh, I can do this. That's not some impossible thing. It was also the time when I started really getting the sense, and this is something we also all owe Stanley, I think, to some degree. The idea that there was a writer. He was really one of the first editors to insist that inkers get a separate credit, things like that, which is never talked about, which is too bad. It's one of his great contributions to the medium, because he understood, like, a lot of people worked on this. It's not, it's not instant breakfast. Like, for a long time, people just thought there was, like, an inker and a writer, maybe, and that was it. But, there was an editor, sometimes there was a plotter who sort of oversaw the whole book. There was the equivalent of, like, a script supervisor who made sure you didn't do anything weird, like, put Batman's logo upside down or whatever stupid thing they were obsessed with. But that sense that there were real people behind these things were really important. And when they did their anthologies, Marvel Superhero Origins, Son of Origins, these were the collections that my mother bought for me at Sears here in the Bronx. There were introductions where he talked about how these stories came about and what the artists did and why Daredevil lives in Hell's Kitchen and not in Jackson Heights with Spider-Man and things like that seem, not important to some outsider who doesn't love this material. But when you're trying to find your way in the world and trying to find out what's the secret to this stuff, because it looks very occult and weird. You pick up a comic drawn by Jim Steranko, like one of the Nick Fury things, and you're just like, I can't do this. I could never do this. And genius is demoralizing that way. You hear a concerto by somebody, and you go, that's... But if you were to be able to sit over their shoulder and see how they built it layer by layer, and how they talked to other musicians in the pit, and how they developed it over time.
It gives an order to the universe, right?
Well,
consistency.
The sad part of being an artist, if you're really committed to what you do, is that the magic is always destroyed, right? When I started learning about film, the first thing that happened to me was every time I'd look at a car ad, I could see where the lights were off camera. Every hot spot. And I can't not think that way, When I started editing for clients for the first time, I remember I had to use a bit of news footage. It was Peter Jennings in this film. They got the rights to use him in the background. And I noticed that he drew a breath every time before he spoke. And now every time I look at a newscaster, for the rest of my life, since 1995, I see this. Good night, blah, 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 whatever it is they're saying. And now sports, if you really listen, you'll watch them do it every time. They draw in this pronounced breath so that they don't run out of... And all those little weird things are part of becoming an artist. It's, deconstructing all the little secret processes that, frankly are, it's the stuff of, the special features on a DVD. But you've got to live in that world if you want to create that stuff. And not that I want to destroy comics for a generation of kids, but I want them to see what's possible. Because with comics, they can create universes. They really can.